This goes a long way in terms of kids internalizing their own set of rules and kind of following those rules because they have those cognitive, explanations, right? So, for example, inductive method would be, let's say you've got a 4th of July, celebration, and you have a child that's chasing a cat with a sparkler, right? A parent using the inductive method would say, stop chasing the cat with the sparkler. You could hurt Spot, or whatever the cat's name is, or you could hurt Fluffy, right? So there's directive, don't do that, this is why. You could hurt the animal, so you don't want to do that. So inductive methods will always have kind of that, think about those conversations we have with the little ones, and we already know how important that is, given Tuesday's, lecture, right? Always have a conversation with the little one to check their understanding, right? But when we provide a reasoning for why they should not or should do something, it goes a long way with them being able to reason these things out later in terms of directing their own behavior. Having those explanations is really, really important. So that reasoning or explaining, very important, very big part of using inductive methods, right? Power assertive methods, this is where you have, the parents that are laying down the law. Typically they use physical punishment. They'll rationalize using that physical punishment because they say, well, I spank my child because they don't comply with what I tell them to do, right? But there's that lack of conversation with the child, lack of checking understanding. It's like, you will do it this way, and if you don't, there'll be some severe consequences, whether, physical punishment is typical, or you can't, you're going to bed with no dessert, right? Or, I'm grounding you. You can't go out this weekend, or whatever that might, whatever might be hurtful to the child in terms of restricting their activities, right? So power assertive, you have the power parent, if you will, that's laying down the law and does so in a very strict manner. And they'll follow up if the child doesn't follow through with doing what the parent asks. They're going to follow through with the spanking, or they're going to deny access to something, right? So that's power assertive, right? And of course, this doesn't do very well in terms of that child being able to develop those internal standards that will guide their behavior later. As we discussed with the inductive methods, which are preferred, obviously, when you provide that reasoning, right, that child has something to kind of hold on to in terms of this is why I should act in this way. They have something to direct their behavior. With power assertive, that's lacking. They're like, do it this way, right, and there's no conversation about it. If you don't, there'll be consequences, right? So imagine, again, back to the example of there's a 4th of July party, child's, chasing cat with a sparkler, right? Parent will take sparkler, right? Don't do that, right? Go to your room, right? Or taking the sparkler, maybe, what are you doing? Spanking the child, right? Actually, and this picture here was very hard to pick out, right? I am very biased in my feelings about spanking. It physically hurts me to think about, it hurts like right here when I think about kids being hit, right? And so it's like, no, there's so many other ways to guide behavior, right? The spanking, it's really, demoralizing to the child. It's hurtful. It really doesn't go anywhere beyond in terms of trying to correct behavior outside of just that spanking, right? So even just picking out this simple picture, you guys, oh, student, you're all sensitive. Yeah, I am sensitive to the little ones, right? Protect them. Don't spank them. Let's give them direction. Let's have conversations. So power assertive method, taking away privileges, spanking, right? We also have the withdrawal of love method. This is where you isolate or ignore the misbehavior, right? Which doesn't work because oftentimes the kid is misbehaving because that's exactly what they want, so they end up misbehaving even more because they're doing more drastic things because they want that, parent's attention, right? But this is where you have a parent who is saying things like, I can't even be in the room with you right now. And that's very hurtful to kids. So that withdrawal is very threatening to kids, and they might be able to get them to temporarily comply with their directives, right? But it's very hurtful, and you have kids that can end up with guilt, right, and anxiety as a result of that love withdrawal. So you have, a parent, again, back to the 4th of July, we have a kid chasing the cat with the sparkler, parents stepping in saying, don't chase Fluffy with the sparkler, right? You know what, I can't even look at you right now. I can't believe you just did that, right? And that's it's hurtful and hard on kids. There was a really clever study that was conducted where they looked at kids from, I believe it was from 4 up to like 18. And they had these kids look at different scenarios of misbehavior. Some of them were, running around the house and not listening to the parent who told them to stop. Something got broken. Some had to do with, causing harm to others, or saying mean things. And then they had scenarios in terms of how the parents should react to the child. How should the child, how should that behavior be corrected? And so they had different scenarios in terms of the inductive method. Should the parent A, go in and, tell the child why they shouldn't do what they were doing, right? Should it be, something along the lines of, do you think the child should be spanked for this typical, for this type of behavior? Or do you think the parent should say things like, I can't even look at you right now, and just withdraw their love, right? So they gave them several different scenarios. Because the question was, what type of behavior do kids want parents to engage in to correct their behavior? It turns out they chose, obviously, the inductive method. This is how parents should discipline their children. They rated physical punishment and love withdrawal at pretty much the same rate. In other words, it was just as hurtful to kids, right, for the spanking to happen as the love withdrawal, right? I mean, the numbers, I didn't have the chart to put it up, but the numbers were like really, really striking. It's like for some age groups, they actually preferred the spanking over the love withdrawal, right? Because spanking, it's, immediate, and it's much better than having that love withdrawal, right? So when we look at, ask kids, what do you prefer? They're like, well, inductive method for sure. Well, what about spanking or love withdrawal? Well, those are pretty much the same evils, basically, right? So some really interesting numbers came out of that particular study. So when you are dealing with preschoolers, and I've kind of mentioned this before, if you have a child that you're trying to direct their behavior, it's easier to get them to do, instead of just saying, stop that, it's easier to get them to comply to directives by telling them to do something else, right? And I've kind of mentioned this before. So a very effective way to reroute a child's behavior, I'll just put it that way, is to have them engage in something else, right, when they're acting in ways that you want to correct. For example, if you have a preschooler who's artistic, right, and they're doing a mural on the wall, right, it's, instead of just saying, stop that, right, it's more effective to say, we don't draw on the wall, this is why, let's use, the inductive method, have a little conversation, let's redirect this, why don't you do this over here on this paper, or this, butcher paper, right, because if they're drawing something big, do it on something else, right? You're going to get a child at this age that's going to comply much more readily when you say, well, let's not do it there, this, we're destroying, not make it age appropriate, but they're destroying property pretty much. Let's do it over here, this is the appropriate place to do it. So teach them what the appropriate is and then give them that opportunity. You're going to get children that comply much more easily when you redirect their behavior, right? All right, so Baumrind is one who conducted a lot of research looking at the different behaviors that parents engage in, right? And the different types of children that kind of result, right? As a consequence of how these parents guide their children's behavior, what they do. So in her work, right, she came up with 4 different patterns of parenting. We have the authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, indulgent, and rejecting, neglecting. So we'll go through, I have this set up where you have the type of parenting, right? What happens in terms of the child characteristics? What kinds of children, come from parents who are authoritative, right? And I'll give you one example, and I'll use it across all 4 of them. So with authoritative parenting, right? The parenting behaviors, there are rules to abide by, but they're flexible. The demands that they make on the children are sensitive in that the parents are aware of the abilities of what the kid can do, right? So they make them reasonable demands. So for example, an authoritative parent who's taking a 4-year-old to wait in a doctor's office is going to be well prepared and knows that that child has a very small attention span, is going to have things readily available, coloring books, books to read, or what have you, right? So the demands will be, you can't run around screaming in the doctor's office, right? But there's going to be that understanding that, well, I can make certain demands. I can't expect you to, sit with me for a little bit while we're reading books, and I can't expect you to play, quietly if there's, toys. If they're going to the pediatrician, there's going to be toys, right? But I'm not going to let you just run around, right? So they can have those demands, but they're going to be reasonable demands, right? They also provide explanations. So with authoritative parenting, these are the parents that are going to use the affective explanations, right? They're going to use the inductive method, right? Affective explanations are those explanations where you connect the child's wrongdoing to the harm they cause to others, right? So that's kind of part of that inductive method, having that conversation with the little one. So authoritative parents are ones who will employ those inductive methods, right? Having that conversation. This is why we don't do that, right? They're also open to the child's viewpoint. So the child might say, but last time I was really good, or what if I can, do this? And so a parent who is authoritative, right, is going to say, okay, well, you know what, you make a good point, let's go ahead. So they're going to give value to that child's input. They say, you know what, you make a good point, we'll go ahead and do it that way, right? So they have like a democratic control, right? So there's that conversation, right? The child's viewpoint is valued. So I'll give you a scenario. The dreaded request by children for any parent is, can I ride my bike in the street? It's terrifying for us, okay? Depending upon the street, right, that you live on, it's a terrifying request, right? But once kids get their skills down for riding a bike, they want to go beyond just the driveway, right? They want to go into the street. It's a terrifying request for a parent. But an authoritative parent will say, okay, yes, you can ride in the street, but here's the rules. You always have to have your helmet on, you're geared up, elbow pads, knee pads, right? You have to stay on this side of the street. I don't want you to get hurt. If you fall, your helmet's going to protect you, so they're giving this rationale. This is why I want you to do it this way. You've got to stay on this side of the street, because if you go back and forth, a car might not see you, you could get really hurt. So please stay this side of the street, and I'll let you go from our end of the property on this side over to our end of the property on that side, okay? This side of the street, in front of my house, and I have to be out there with you, right? So an authoritative parent is going to say, yeah, you can do that. Here's what the rules are. Here's why I'm giving you those rules. So when we have parents that, that kind of engage with their children like this, we have kids that are happy, right? They have responsibility, both social and otherwise, because they are given rationale for why they have to behave the way they do. So they're kind of taking on their own, well, I know why I have to stay on this side of the street. I want to be safe, right? So this is why I'm going to comply with that, right? They're self-reliant. They're achievement-oriented, right? And they make better friends, right? So they make better playmates, right? Because they have that kind of that self-control, right? They listen to the parents' directives and so forth, right? So an authoritative parent too, let's say the child is listening to the directions, right? A week or so goes by, and the child then says, I want to ride my bike in the street, but I want to go farther, right? And the parent will say, you know what? I'm going to provide the explanations, but I'm going to listen to your viewpoint. You know what? You've done really good listening to me. I'm going to go, okay, so you can go to this end of our property, and I'll let you go in front of our neighbors. You can go in front of Mr. and Mrs. Wilson's as well, at the end of their property. Okay, let's try that out for a little bit. So there's going to be value to what the child, kind of puts into the conversation. And the parent will consider it and say, yeah, actually you've listened to the rules really good. Because you've listened to the rules, we're going to go ahead and extend it this side of the street, geared up, parent has to be out there, but we're going to extend it out, right? And then just kind of go from there. So that would be authoritative parenting. We have authoritarian parenting. I have students, whenever students give me mnemonics to help other students, I always use them, right? So a lot of times students get authoritative and authoritarian mixed up. So I had a student a couple years ago say, well, authoritarian rhymes with barbarian. And I'm like, I like it. So your mnemonic is going to be authoritarian rhymes with barbarian, right? They're very strict, right? Definitely not authoritative. That's the way to go, right? So authoritarian parents are very restrictive. They expect very strict compliance to the rules that are laid down by the parent, right? Big power assertive stuff. They rarely explain why they have to do what the parent asked them to do, right? So they're not having a conversation about why they have to comply to the rules that are laid down by the parents, right? So they have punitive, forceful tactics to get the child to comply with their directives, right? And in terms of children's viewpoints, a lot of times like, you're the child, I'm the parent. This is how it is. I'm laying down the law. So if you can imagine back to the bike riding request, child asks parent, can I ride my bike in the street? No. And if I catch you out there, you are going to get the spanking of your life, right? So they're just laying down the law. They expect strict adherence to that particular law, right? but I'm, so-and-so. I don't care. I'm the parent. It's my house, my rules. You do it this way, right? So, not surprisingly, we have children who have different characteristics when they have authoritarian parents, right? Boys, depending upon the level of restrictiveness and power assertion by the parent, you can have boys that might end up being hostile or defiant. Kids are natural explorers. They want to try things out. It's a big world out there. They want to try all these things out. So when they're restricted, sometimes they will rebel, right? With girls, a lot of times they can become low in their own independence, right? So they have difficulty negotiating relationships because they've always been in that relationship where they're always told exactly what they do and they better comply, right? Also, we have kids, not surprisingly, that are anxious and they're irritable. I mean, who wouldn't be irritable if you're told what to do all the time and you had no say in the matter, right? It's your life too, right? You have to have rules, of course, but when you're given rules where you have no say in them, it makes for irritable kids, understandably so, right? And they're also restrained in their social interactions because they don't have that conversation with the parent about their viewpoint. There's no value to their viewpoint, right? Well, what if I just in front of our house, what if they set their own rules? The parent's like, hey, I laid down the law. You're going to listen to me, right? So authoritarian. Make sense? Very big distinction between those two. We also have the permissive indulgent parents. These parents are accept their children, loving, but they're very lax, right? They make few demands. They, permit the kids to be kids. Kids will be kids, right? They're drawing on the wall. Kids will be kids, right? They don't closely monitor what the child is engaged in, and they will rarely exert control in terms of, you need to stop that, right? So back to the riding the bike in the street example, a permissive indulgent parent, right? Can I ride my bike in the street? Sure, honey, go ahead, have fun, right? I love you. I'll be back, at dinner time, right? With child characteristics, they don't do as well in school. Makes sense if you have parents that don't often provide guidelines for behavior and reasons for those behaviors, right? Then you have kids that are like, I'm going to do my own thing. You're not my parent, right? There's more misconduct. Sometimes they can engage in other behaviors that are less appealing, right? Getting into drugs or alcohol because they have parents that are like, well, yeah, go ahead. Your kids will be teens will be teens. That's what kids do, right? Teenagers, sneak out at night and do stuff, right? Although these kids aren't so worried about it because the parents not making a lot of demands on them, right? In terms of competence and social competence, they can be relatively high in their social confidence, right? Their ability to relate to others. They can make good friends, right? They can be warm with friends, right? So they can have good social skills because you still have, these parents are accepting, these permissive indulgent parents, they're accepting, and the kids can go out and explore and kind of do these things. So they can be relatively high in this. Although sometimes with this parenting style, these kids are kind of used to having things their own way, so sometimes it can be a little bit hard to get along with, right? So again, with the permissive indulgent, yeah, go ahead and go ride your bike. That's okay, sweetie. I'll see you at dinner time. Have a good time, right? But maybe look both ways before you cross the street, right? So they're going to give maybe very lax rules about riding their bike in the street. And then we have rejecting and neglecting parents. These parents are very, they're not involved. They're uninvolved. Maybe it might be because they're really overwhelmed with things that are going on in life, right? You have parents working, multiple jobs, right? So there's a lot of different reasons as to why parents, parent the way they do. But we might have parents that are overwhelmed. They really don't have the time or the energy to engage with children, right? They're low in responsiveness, right, and support because they might be just lacking that time and energy to engage with their children, right? So they're rejecting, neglecting parents, right? Hey, I want to ride my bike in the street, I promise. I don't care, just go do what you gotta do, right? I'm busy, right? I'm trying to figure out bills right now, right? So child characteristics, these kids are the least competent. They don't have that good solid foundation with their parents, right? They lack in responsibility because they're not given those directives and why those directives are given, right? So they have that lack of opportunity to internalize those rules that guide behavior, right? In terms of maturity, well, because they don't have that ability to express themselves with their parents and also go out and explore in a way that's constructive, right? They have that strained relationship with the parents, right? they're not very mature in how they interact with their age mates, right? So rejecting, reflecting, parenting. So you've seen the parenting characteristics, right? And the child characteristics for these 4 types according to Baumreich. So I want to do our in-class activity based upon this